Guys, I'm JDubs. I have won 3 majors in CSGO, and this is Thorin's YouTube channel.
I'm back with the new edition of my video AMA, which in theory goes monthly. At the moment, I'm doing them twice a month. If things keep going well, probably keep that up. Anyone who donates $10 or more and accesses one of those tiers on Patreon can ask a question. Find the link to subscribe to Patreon in the description box below, just as you will also find a link to the next question gathering thread where people can submit said questions. So question number 1 is by Barbara Stanwyck's Legs, and it's not about Quake, believe it or not, this time. So they say, you decide to bulk up and go into the WWE, World Wrestling Entertainment, or whatever the fuck it's called, the most famous wrestling federation, basically. Tell us about your gimmick, entrance music, appearance, moves, etc., and whom you would feud with early on. Right, I mean, essentially, I already sort of know a lot of the things that go on in this world, because that's what I basically did with my on-camera persona in CSGO. If people aren't aware, like, what I'm like on By the Numbers is not that dissimilar to what I'm like a bit as a person, or if I was with friends or something, I was in a bar or something. But a lot of what I did with my on-camera persona for events, I absolutely made a wrestling-esque character. Like, the joke is that on most of those broadcasts, I put forward a perception that, like, I'm never wrong. Basically, like, when I was a kid, I liked a lot of the, obviously when I was young, like everyone, you like the faces, just the popular people, Diamond Dallas Page or whatever the fuck. But then as I got older, like a lot of people, I started to like the villains, the heels. So one of them that I was always a big fan of is one of the manager ones. It was that guy like Bobby the Brain Heenan or whatever the fuck he was. Where the whole point was he was just obnoxious. But you wanted to see him lose and his people get beaten as a result. But also if you could fuck with his like villain vibe, you sort of liked the way he was an asshole to people. So I tried to shape some of that because again, I wanted that Mayweather component where people either want to watch me because they like me or they want to watch me because they're just waiting to see what stupid shit I say next and get annoyed at it or frustrated or whatever, but they have to watch. That's what I did. I made myself essential. I was must watch television as it was. So actually, I won't really go into massive details about like a theme here. Like if I was going to do something, I'll probably do something similar, like in the vein of like Ted DiBiase. I'd do something about like being the Skrilla Lord or something, and the idea would be, you know, I'd come in, oh, he has a termination clause for the contract, and then I hit that guy over the head with the fucking steel chair or whatever and take Nicola Nyholm's fucking massive suitcase full of illicit Danish government money, grant money or something. So maybe I'd do a loser leaves town match with Nicola Nyholm, and obviously we'd be rigged up to lie detectors as it was going on, etc. I'd be like, you know, the Punisher, the guy who forces the truth out of him, some shit like that. But what I was alluding to is, actually there's a point here to be made that I have done that in my career. I've even actually tried, because I've noticed certain storylines, this is not just something that, I mean, mythologically people obviously have identified this throughout human history in terms of the stories that have been told and the religious mythology, etc., and how that has certain archetypes that seem to play out both in how human beings conceptualize the world and how actually certain functions of nature actually basically take place and their relationship with us. But I think you can go on a much, much lower level, which is that when you just come to pop culture, which is kind of a bastardization of these principles just to make money, a few little magic squares, in that setting, actually I think they already do utilize certain very limited like human drama dynamics that exist in basically all kinds of cultures. And that's why actually things like wrestling are very successful. It's very easy to see like the betrayal, or someone's loyal to someone, or someone saves someone you thought they were out on, or oh, someone's reunited with someone, or wow, he didn't forget about that, or wow, he's turned his back on this guy once again. So there's so many simple human drama elements that go into it that I have actually tried to utilize those in my career. So for example, when I stop working with someone, if there's someone who I actually think is now corrupt or has turned against people and is disloyal, I will frame it along these simple storylines and play into those elements because I think they take a firmer grip in people's minds. It's one of the reasons why, if you didn't know the reasons, you would think that like a wrestling heel, I've turned on many people and changed my allegiances. In reality, they were the people who changed already, usually gradually over the time I worked with them, and eventually became unrecognizable. And so I suddenly, you know, one year I'm against Blast and I'm with ESL, then the next year I'm with Blast and I'm against ESL. It can switch around depending on what the year is. Now, I will say, a point I will tie that to is because, especially for the last 4 or 5 years, I've made made it about my integrity being one of my number one factors in how I decide where I work, who I work with, and what I do with them, that what I try to do when I work with someone is I try to encourage them, if you want to work with me, you have to come up to the level of my ideals. I'm not going to sink down to yours or compromise myself just for some money. And so I will tell you right now, I think these people do that. I think the reason why Blast brought me back is they wanted to turn their image around. They wanted to show that they were just going to hire the best people. They wanted to put on a broadcast show that nobody else could, because guess what? At the time I was working with Blast, that's the only place you could see the Sponge and Thorin combo. In my opinion, probably the best modern day combo in terms of the analyst desk. You can't see it on ESL desks anymore. Sponge doesn't work with Flashpoint. So I think they did it quite shrewdly. I think ESL was smart enough. If you notice, they never invited me to all their events. They never invited me to all of them and just gave me full purview. What they did instead was they had a couple of big ones and notable ones that they would invite me to, so they could still have a relationship with me, but not have to be too close and not give me any control of it. So if people don't know, I've already been doing some of these things, even though this was a light-hearted question, actually in my career. So I thought that might be interesting to people. Soliko says, what is the best underdog run in the history of Counter-Strike? Was it on par with OG's TI8 run? Right, so a couple of issues here is, even though I certainly do think that the TI8 run was, just in terms of all the context, I actually did a bad job with that video. It's one of the few videos I've ever thought about taking down. Maybe I'll redo it one day. Maybe I'll go and dig out the script, correct the few mistakes I made in it, and redo it in a better fashion. Because it's one of the only videos I look back on it. Bear in mind I'm the historian, that one doesn't hold up very well. But the point of making the video at the time, even though I kind of fumbled a bunch of the details, is that is as an example of one of the craziest possible runs in terms of the context. Like, I don't care that, yes, some of those players in that team would already have gone down as potential Hall of Famers. That lineup had no business ever winning that tournament, especially not in the way that they did, counter to the meta with all those unique picks, performances that you expected from nowhere. People like Anna, who quite frankly looked like they'd already hit their peak, just having monster performances. The whole thing was ridiculous. So there's nothing comparable to that, I don't really think, but I can give you some pretty good ones. I'd also say, by the way, I think even though that one, because it was such an underdog run, deserves to be counted. I think TI win of Team Liquid was pretty fucking epic. Like, I think that was amazing, even though they were one of the best teams. The way they came through the lower bracket was unbelievable in that one. Whereas, I mean, in this case, the TI8 run, at least they went through the upper bracket all the way and only dropped in the upper final, right? So, is that even true? Did they? I think I might have made that up, didn't I? I think I did actually. No, wait, let me think. No, they did win that game. No, I don't think they whatever, who gives a fuck? Right, the big issue when it comes to Counter-Strike, though, is we don't really have that many lower brackets. Like, we had lower brackets at the CPL majors in early Counter-Strike. We've had a couple more recently, but even then, not in majors, not in the biggest tournaments. So the real problem is, without lower brackets, we're mainly talking in CSGO just about great singular limb runs, and therefore, if you want it to be like a big underdog run, I've got to pick some, actually, that are quite recent. Like, I've got to say a Vanguard at the last major, the Starlight Berlin major. They had no business even making top 8. Even making top 16, it was questionable. They weren't a good team. I know people don't get it, but they just had a month where they were really good. I don't know why it was. Don't know what it was. A lot of teams got reset after that player break. They didn't. I mean, they basically had a lot of boot camp for fucking 2 years. I don't know what it is, but they were garbage before that. A couple of months, they weren't very good again. They could barely beat anyone in a best of 3. That has to be one of the craziest runs ever. Their win over Vitality is just unbelievable. I can't even believe that actually happened, despite the problems that the Vitality had with MBK that led to them kicking him. Like, I still think that on paper, there's no way they're even supposed to make it past the quarters, the semis, and then, listen, they got smashed in the final, but they should never have been in the final. So that's one of the craziest I've ever seen. Like I said on the desk, I thought it was one of the most ridiculous upsets of all time when they beat Vitality. Everyone else was like, what are you talking about? Because people are just full of shit in the moment. The other one I think you have to throw in there is probably big at ESL 1 Cologne 2018. People forget. Like, they went out of the upper bracket in, like, the second round once it got to the best of 3s, basically. After that, a lot of people don't know this detail. People remember them beating G2 and looking good. People remember them outclassing FaZe in the semis. And then having, like, a couple of close maps in the final, losing to Na'Vi. You know what no one mentions, by the way, is this team could have finished, like, second to last, third to last, because in the lower bracket, when they dropped down, they played Renegades, which, if we're thinking this is in 2018, that was a good Renegades It wasn't like the best one, but it was still a good Renegades line. There was still some solid ones. This was the one where they at least were still a playoff team. They barely won that one. It was incredibly close on the third map in overtime. Then they played against MIBR. Again, people forget this. It was incredibly close on the third map. This one was like double or triple overtime. So there's a world where they don't even go past those rounds. So the fact that they then got to the stage, then beat the G2 team that was looking pretty good actually that tournament, and then beat FaZe Clan with a bunch of fucking sick players, that, and who'd also won like ESL Belo Horizonte, etc. That was ridiculous. Like, that was an amazing run. Again, even if they lost in the finals, I think that has to be put up there. If you want to go for 1.6, I can pick a couple out for you, but they're more like the context is what makes them crazy as opposed to on paper result. So the IEM Intel Extreme Masters 2 finals in 2008 had the Korean team Eastro, where some of the members had been Project KR members in the past, but that period of them being good at the WEG tournaments was considered just because they were at WEG. It was actually Lunatic High, which were the Koreans that did better at the Western tournaments. But in this particular case, this team with Solo and Bale and Termini, all those guys, had an insane run where they made it to the final of this IEM tournament. Admittedly, it was best of ones and they won a lot of Inferno games, but they beat a bunch of the best teams in Europe, and they were close to potentially winning this tournament, which was a major, the one that obviously Mouse Sports of 6 ended up winning, was the big major in their careers. So that was an incredible run. I remember everyone just being like, what the fuck is going on with this? Solo's in sick form. Another one similarly, actually this one is a German team. It's going to be Alternate Attacks' championship campaign at the World Series of Video Games, WSVG, New York finals, because the finals of that massive tour meant that first place was 50k, which I think at the time was actually the highest for any like major or major level event for first place. It was way bigger than CPLs and ESWC at the time. And then also, if you won, each member of the team got a Rolex watch, and it was in New York at this massive event. So it had all the best teams of the year. They had the Fnatic team that was obviously monster, but hadn't yet won championships. It had, I think it might have had MIBR in the earlier stages. It had the Complexity team that was very good. It had Team 3D who finished second. Had pretty much everyone. It had all the top tier. NIP, I think, was there early on. Had all the best teams of the year. And who were the winners, right? Listen, you might know that Alternate Attacks had been successful and won big tournaments already and been a top team already that year, or one of the elite teams that year. How about put it that way? They'd been a team finishing second at ESWC and third elsewhere, or maybe that was top 4 there. They had all sorts of top finishes. But then what happened, people forget, is Mouse Sports signed 3 of their players. They signed Capio, Tixo and Silver from the Attacks team. And so what happened was, even though they'd signed those players weren't yet something like eligible to come over to Mouse Sports yet. I think maybe because of the ESL Pro League, ESL Pro League Germany, ESL Pro Series Germany rather. So as a result, what's bizarre is they let like some player stand in at this event from what I remember, and then also Attacks took in Roman, not to be confused with Roman R from Mouse Sports of past, but Roman, the player who'd been a monster, who'd later be in Mouse Sports, who obviously did great things in this Attacks team. He came as a stand-in, was one of the best German players. And then they had to use their fucking manager, a guy called Chucky, who used to be a player like 3 or 4 years earlier as a pro, and used to play with Moon actually in the old teams that were in those European Euro Cup finals, etc. And in this setting, like, they had no business ever winning this tournament, and they straight up won the event. And listen, epic game against Team 3D, but they won the whole event. Like, that's an insane run. That's like some movie level shit where you don't even believe the storyline when you hear the context of it. Like, I'd love to make a documentary or something about that sort of a team in the future. Spoonfed 89 says, with Liquid having benched Nitro over recent poor online form, both personally and for the team, I was wondering how you would react if you were a team GM of a previously elite team in a similar situation. How soon would you cut a player you believe to be an issue, and would something like Astralis' incredible longevity and ability to return to form cause you to delay making that cut at all? Would online results have any effect? Right, I can answer all these parts. So first of all, in terms of if I'm a GM, I have a rule. You never break up a lineup that can win until you know they can't win anymore. So Team Liquid, quite frankly, once they came to that blast, I was done with that lineup overall, actually. At that point in time, I thought a lineup change needed to be made in at least a coaching change. So I would be a lot quicker than others would. I'm more from like the Belichick school of thinking, or the Popovich school of thinking in that sense. You just get rid of them when it's the right time to. You don't wait and have sentimentality. So let someone else be sentimental and gamble on a player who's now past their prime or isn't that good anymore, has been figured out. So I would make my moves way quicker than most people. In terms of the idea of like, cutting a player. I also think this, though. I think when a top team falls off like that, especially if they don't just go from number 1 to number 2 and still win the odd title, usually it means there's more than one person's a problem, in my opinion. It's like a bigger problem in the team. So I think usually you should probably make 2 changes instead of 1 and identify the 2 most problem players, but then crucially, recruit for what you need to become a great team or get really good players and figure a way to make them into a great team. In terms of the whole Astralis angle, Astralis are the exception to the rule, and quite frankly, I don't think they even count within this context. Like, did Astralis keep playing and trying their absolute hardest and just get beaten by Ents because Ents was better, or Astralis didn't know how to play Nuke anymore, or Astralis didn't know what to do against Team? No, Astralis crippled themselves. They sabotaged themselves. We'll never know when they would have dropped off. Maybe they would have had all the same success in the summer, but then dropped off by the next major. Who can know? This, like, retconning that they were somehow, like, super smart and that they knew what they were doing and knew they'd be able to come back, it's all nonsense. It's a load of bullshit. Nicola Nyman and Astralis did that shit to boost the Blast and try and create a scenario where in the future maybe they could just skip events by just playing Blasts and others and make Blast the place to go. And in doing so, he crippled his team's competitive performance. The fact that they then came back and were amazing, he didn't know that shit. That had nothing to do with him or people who were fucking handball coaches or sports psychologists putting you on a fucking couch. It had nothing to do with any of that nonsense. So in terms of like online results, I wouldn't let online results, except for this era, influence me making an offline move. Like, I'm making all my moves based on land, but at the moment there are no lands and it's going to be too long before there are. So I don't mind making moves right now, put it that way. And quite frankly, no teams, as far as I've seen, ever really did do the comeback. Nicholas Ryback says, thoughts on the Wheel of Time series if you read it? I haven't read it. One of the problems is I'm not actually a big fan of sort of swords and sorcery type fantasy. What I liked about the Game of Thrones series, which isn't even called the Game of Thrones, it's a Song of Ice and Fire, is the fact that it wasn't really about the swords and sorcery element that much. It was more about like political intrigue, human relationships, really great character creation and storytelling and backstories, etc. It wasn't really about the swords. So I've never really found swords and sorcery stuff that interesting. I can fuck with Tolkien a bit, but even then some of that's a bit dry to me. So I've just never been that interested in it. I get if you love it, there's a million books of it, but it just hasn't drawn me in, mate. There's a lot of series that don't. Girthy Moth says, besides the advantage that being a native English speaker provides for broadcast work and the old trope that the UK esports scene is toxic, in your opinion, what are the major contributing factors of the disparity in the huge amount of esports broadcast talent coming out of the UK compared to the lack of talented players/teams? I mean, you can't just look past the fact that it is our native language. And not only that, we have all the slang, we have just enough of a weird bleed over from American culture that even British people tend to know, like American culture, hip-hop culture, slang from American movies. So I think as a result, we're just the most perfectly situated to kind of be the touchstone for all culture speaking English to some degree. So I think that's a massive factor. I think it's probably one of the main factors. I also think I still think that most talent on camera aren't even that good. I think even most of the best people are like a 7 or an 8 out of 10. I think we're far from having any 10 out of 10s. I think a lot of the people who work in the field, and clearly a lot of the people who never shut the fuck up about certain diversity initiatives, even though they're clearly they've benefited from them. I think a lot of people are like 5 out of 10s on camera. It's just that you haven't been asked to do that much on camera. You don't have a lot of like creative wiggle room. You're doing fairly short segments. You're just doing similar things. Sometimes it's just not that big a deal if you flummox a whole segment. I'm actually quite underwhelmed. So I wouldn't like make it a big up thing for the UK. Like, yeah, the UK is doing great in that sense. We're beating every other country. But first of all, it is our language. And then secondly, if anything, it just shows up America, right? What shouldn't America be number one with how many fucking people they have and all the middle class people who in theory could take time off to come into esports? So I don't think there's anything massive to go into there. I think having banter probably helps as well. In my opinion, entertaining is the number one thing you do on camera. Not educate, not inform, not be professional. It's about entertaining. So I think having banter and some of that kind of sense for a bit of being willing to fuck around a little bit, I think that definitely engenders interest and people liking you on camera more. I've even noticed it in games like League of Legends where people have liked people more. Pronogo says, and by the way, I don't think there's anything to do with the lack of pro players. Like the pro player angle, there's a million separate things to do with that I don't think has anything to do in this particular case. I mean, for example, I think the cost of university and all these sorts of factors is a massive problem in that regard. Like, so you should see what it costs if you want to go to a Nordic country. Pronogo says, hi Thorin, you said you weren't interested in Brood War from a gameplay standpoint until you gathered enough historical context to put the player's achievements into perspective. Has that changed? Would an RTS ever interest you beyond a spectator's point of view? No. Right, basically, I mean, first of all, Brood War had shit graphics. It obviously came out in like the mid-90s. I just generally find that RTS games, I find very hard to tell a lot of the micro elements. I don't find that interesting either, or that compelling. What I found amazing about Brood War was that I discovered not only did it have arguably the best historical context, that's the sort of scene I always dreamed that Quake or Counter-Strike could have, of amazing tournaments and all playing each other and having championships that you get the badges for, and people having intros where they're the legend that you have to do. I love all that shit. All the theatrics, all the accoutrements, all the surrounding ancillary elements of the scene were amazing. And then also, when I discovered that in the game, like every playing style is accounted for, even races that literally by the patches are imbalanced can be beaten or worked around with creativity and discipline and strategical elements and preparing for the opponent. So it was mainly all those things. Like RTSs, I don't particularly find that interesting. I thought Warcraft 3 was shit. I never found that an interesting game, and the lock elements disgusted me, quite frankly, the fact that people were comparing that to games that I like Counter-Strike. So I've never been that interested in RTS, but it's not for me. I think FPS for me, and then even the strategical side I had to get into over time. A Crunchy Captain says, your second channel video, Anthony Davis has already got, like, by the way, aged like fucking fine wine, because you can tell the people who don't have an actual eye test, because they just go by how good your team is. So they were going, how good could he be? He's barely making the playoffs. Mate, you could see after year 2 with this guy, he was literally like a Hakeem Olajuwon, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, like next level, unique talent, once in a generation player who you just, nobody can fuck with his all around game. So it doesn't surprise me that now he's with LeBron. People are complimenting it, but even then they just skew it and say LeBron's even better. So I think that's one that's absolutely good. Anyway, back to the question. That video is one of my personal favourite videos you've made. I was wondering if there is any desire for you to produce more traditional sports content on that channel. Yes, I'm almost certain it'll happen this year. I've just got some own things. I mean, if you've seen very recently some of my tweets, basically I have to rethink my own business approach to my main work of esports. But once I've gotten that in place, I have big plans for that second channel, and certainly more sports content like that video where I give actually quite controversial opinions will potentially be on the cards. I have a lot of interesting things I think I could get into there. Scatman in bed. If you were to build a new North around MSL in a world without buyouts, obviously I can pick whoever I want here, where you could hand pick players from both Mad Lions and Heroic, which players would you choose and what would be the potential of the team? You can also keep current players in this scenario. Right, I'm actually going to just go out ahead and say, I bet most people probably couldn't actually tell me the current active North lineup. Might even fail on the Heroic one and would only know Mad Lions, because Mad Lions has been relevant and obviously won Flashpoint. So with that said, I'm going to tell you right now as a spoiler, I'm not keeping many players from North. So we'll start with MSL, obviously. By the way, I'm already loving that start. Like, if I get the right players there, I think this is a potential team that could do a lot. So you ask what the potential is, let's go. So MSL's my IGL, so I'm going to run his system. It's going to be tactical. We're going to have people in set roles. They're going to do similar things each round, and he's going to be the mastermind chess player. So MSL's my IGL. Immediately, I'm going to pick A-Core. I actually think A-Core's just an obvious player that should have been in an MSL team. Like, the idea that this guy came up under Hunden, crickets, nobody makes an attempt to sign him. Then he gets a Cillian and wins Flashpoint, cricket. Like, what are you guys doing over there in North? Like, that's the most obvious player you should be throwing checks at from the Trick days onwards, because MSL's needed a really good AWPer. Like, he's not wrong that there aren't any, and that Cajun B's not going to do the job anymore, and that, like, you don't want fucking Yugi. Therefore, I get why MSL makes himself the AWPer, but he doesn't suit that role, and he's not good enough at it. So if you give him A-Core, by the way, already a contender with Device for, like, best Danish AWPer, but Device gets the credit for playing on LAN and have way more accomplishments and doing it against the top higher level opponents, whereas actually I have to say one of the reasons I've been a lot less hot on A-Core than other people have over the summer is because when I saw him in that once he got deep in the Flashpoint, the upper bracket final, the final, and I saw the way he just disappeared against MIBR at times, that was so underwhelming to me. That was where if he'd just played up to his level, they win, like, probably with ease, or comfortably at least. So he's one of the reasons that was a closer series than it needed to be, and why Mad Lions even lost one of those, in my opinion. But he's still young. He's still fairly new to the role in terms of tier 1. So give him the MSL and he could do a lot with a player like that. A very, very good player within a system as well. More of a system AWPer as well than that general AWPer that goes out and gets the picks. I'm also going to take another player from Mad Lions, because the only other player I'm going to take, which is going to be Shush. who I think what I love about his game is he's got passive elements to it. He knows when to lurk. He can play his CT spots, some of them very difficult ones, very, very well. It's really nice spray, nice consistency to his game. I could see him in some senses becoming something like a Magisk boy under MSL, because people don't know, Magisk really began to shine and show he was one of the best players in the world when he was under MSL. That was just brief flukes or glimpses when he was in SK before that. So I'm going to take Shush. I think he's a really nice fragger overall, nice level. So I've already got a really solid beginning to the team here, by the way. Already better than Mad Lions initially. Now for the other two people, this is where it gets a little bit more tricky. Because I would have to say, I think first and foremost, I would go to Heroic and I would take Tesses. Like, this is a guy who from Copenhagen Flames and some of the online games I've seen, his skill level looks really good. His aim looks really good. Like, I feel like this guy in the future, listen, I won't say he's going to be Config, because I think Config is a particularly unique, special mechanical talent. But this guy looks very good, very promising. And again, give him to MSL, let MSL set him up as a star player, and MSL, I think, will show us whether this guy can be a top 20 player in the world. So, Tesses adds some firepower. Then, for the last person, the key thing here is, I've got to say, I haven't watched as much of Heroic and North in the last year as I would need to really go in depth building a team. So for the last spot, I'll name a bunch of people, and it would be more along the lines of I'd have to do in-depth search and check what role overlap there is here. Because if I want to go with another young player, but I'm actually worried that I might not have been able to fill the roles and have enough support development. I mean, Stound's the guy that everyone always raved about from some of these teams, said that should be the player from Heroic who makes it. I haven't been quite convinced myself. I think he hasn't quite broken through, but then again, hasn't had someone like an MSL to lead him. So he's a possibility. Beyond that, Cajun B, if I just want a nice veteran who's going to perform well, and this team just has to be a support of him, I think you could do that easily. You don't care that people are out on Cajun B. AZ similarly can probably do a lot of those similar things. The problem is, I think MSL doesn't necessarily use him the way I would use him at this point in his career, and I don't want to have him putting in any star roles. The last person I've got to recommend is probably Roy, right? I mean, Roy in Mad Lions has done a great job as an entry. Seems like a guy who's a soldier. Maybe we just give MSL Mad Lions, but with MSL and Tesses instead. Maybe that's how I upgrade it and just make it a monster lineup. I think most of these lineups I'm listing here, top 10 team of the world status, should immediately be on the table. Things go amazing. Maybe they can be like 5th best team in the world in the future if an Acor develops into an MVP, or Tessis develops more, or Stound gets better. Like, there's potential for this to be a very good team and to be the future of Danish Counter-Strike, quite frankly. The big one says, are there any CSGO lineups that have been historically successful in causing many upsets, substantial upsets, not, for example, a 20th ranked team beating a 17th ranked team, and not solely by being a kryptonite to one superior team, right? The problem with that question, mate, is, and like I know this is like a newer name, so maybe you haven't done this before, is if the team kept causing significant upsets, so you're talking like top 10 ranked level upsets, eventually they're not going to be an underdog anymore. So like they're not going to be able to, by definition, cause many more of those upsets. So not really, mate. Like the closest you can really come, I think, would be like Na'Vi 2014 or 2015 before they'd really kicked into gear with Flamey, where they could upset the best teams in the world at big lands and beat them. Cloud9 lineups over the years, from the Sean Gares ones that would cause big upsets and get wins every now and then over better teams from Europe, or go into the Stewie2K Shroud era, where again they had a number of times, like that EPL final they had no business winning, but they won it anyway. They would make top 4 at big tournaments the next year in 2017. Furia obviously did it a bunch of times, admittedly in the more recent times more online, but they still did it a number of times offline. People forget they didn't just do the ECS run and beat the likes of Astralis. People forget they then beat the Vitality team, who'd beaten them in the ECS final when they went to, wasn't that result? Am I off the top of my head? Wasn't that the one they lost at DreamHack Masters Dallas? I think it was in the quarterfinals. I think Virtus Pro is a classic example of a team, right? They would always be like dropping down to like 6th or 7th best in the world. Then they'd just come out and smash like the best team in the world in the face and beat them in a best of 3. So I think they're pretty good picks overall, historically in CSGO. Simplord69, with Psyonix announcing the Rocket... I can already tell, by the way, this is going to be a terrible question for me, but we'll ask it anyway. With Psyonix announcing that Rocket League will be free to play on the Epic Store and its reorganisation of its esports league, how do you foresee the future of Rocket League and its esport? Some, such as Ocelot, have stated it can become the biggest game in the West easily, due to its ease of understanding, stability, and potential for public appeal, while other legacy orgs have never entered or have dropped out of the game, such as TSM and Cloud9. In your opinion, will the game rise to Tier 1 status among games such as CS and LOL, or remain stable in Tier 2? Right, I don't care at all about Rocket League. I have never watched Rocket League. I will probably never watch Rocket League. I'm not even interested in actual European soccer, mates. I don't really care about people playing soccer with racing cars. So I don't get where Allsort's coming from on that angle. Like, it's going to be the biggest game in the West easily, etc. I mean, this is a guy who, as far as I know, doesn't have a Dota 2 squad, yet loves Rainbow Six, which, as far as I'm concerned, is a smaller game than Dota 2. Might be wrong on some of the metrics there, but so I think I have a different perspective than Ocelot. I don't think it's going to be a huge game. I don't think people are interested in watching FIFA beyond having a massive casual player base. I don't think people are interested in watching this. I think European soccer isn't even interesting to Americans. So the idea it's going to be a major esports game, I just don't see it personally. If you like it, more power to you. It ain't my shit though. I've already got enough esports games. Ask Blaster 2000. What do you think is the source of League's ridiculous sensitivity to flame/flaming? People on Reddit have somehow convinced themselves that flame is just as bad or worse than real toxicity, inting, AFK, trolling. From my perspective, it seems most other games would bring a typical League Redditor to tears. Did League's increased popularity bring in a lot of non-gamer types to the community? Is it just isolated to Twitter/Reddit? Right, I think you could go pretty deep on this one. So, like, one of the first things, probably one you've never considered because it's just my subjective experiences, this is one of the games, much like StarCraft in the West, Brood War, where a lot of it seemed to be influenced by players for some reason on the west coast of America. So people from California, a lot of middle-class people. Quite frankly, they are the snowflakes, right? They're the people, oh my God, I can't believe he said that. That should be banned and you are toxic. There's just a lot of that because when I first came into StarCraft in esports, I was fucking shocked by how utterly bitch-made they were. I'll just say it like that. Like, these were people unironically crying on forum threads that our player was toxic and a bad sportsman because he didn't type GG at the end of the game. I'm not joking when I say this. They were having real, like, witch hunts over players for not typing GG. That's why to them, Idra is the most shocking. Like, oh my God, it's like a heel out of wrestling. And then in reality, like, Smooya would make that guy cry himself to sleep. Like, he's nothing compared to other esports games. Just a guy who's an arsehole and has bad social skills. That's it. And doesn't understand that people playing more high variance styles can beat you more often than someone playing the correct style but losing to you because they're worse. Like, that's about it. So there was already that which existed. I mean, listen, let's face it. StarCraft in the West was a lot of, like, Asian American second generation immigrants who were playing that game. It was more of a nerd game. It was more of like a more intelligent game, quite frankly. A lot of the other people played Counter-Strike and Quake and these sorts of games that were more visceral, more brutal in that regard. I also think the wider appeal of the game, one of the reasons League of Legends got huge was that it had a way wider appeal, including way more girls and women played League of Legends, especially in the early days, than any other esports game I've ever seen that was actually a big esport. So I think naturally you've seen online women do not appreciate that sort of toxicity, banter, trash talking, going at people and nitpicking. They don't appreciate that. En masse, they seem to pretty much stand against it, complain about it. So I think that encourages that kind of an environment. If people are playing with women that are friends of theirs, I think they're going to be influenced in that sense, and they're going to be like, oh, why won't they just leave her alone? We just want to play League of Legends. I think some of that's involved in it. A lot of people just play Counter-Strike solo or with their mate who's a man as well, and it's more of like a man's game in that regard, in my opinion, in terms of the culture of the subculture that has surrounded the game. I'll also throw in Riot themselves engendered this, just as Overwatch. And Overwatch League is responsible for terrible Overwatch fans by encouraging shitter fans like that. I think also Riot's fucking nonsense pearl clutching that they constantly had in the game. I'm like, oh my God, they danced in front of the fountain. Wow, that's so toxic to tell someone to stop being AFK. Then you find out that they're pieces of shit human beings who are just molesting women, working with tyrants who murder people, going to countries where like no sane person would just go there and go, I'm a good person. I'm just going to virtue signal the second I'm at home about this topic. And then just go somewhere where they kill the people who are like that. I mean, you see now that these are just the worst people ever. So the fact that they were the ones like trying to cause witch hunts and fucking pearl clutching is ridiculous, and it's just summarized best by Riot Light. Here was a guy who was the equivalent of the like super religious person who turns out to be the worst kind of child sex offender ever, because this is a guy who was preaching against toxicity and typing things, and in his personal life was a fucking monster as far as certain stories coming out allege him to be. Just a terrible human being. So I think that was a big part of it, in my opinion. Impulsive says, I think you have previously mentioned that you have done some Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Do you follow the competitive scene at all? It seems that the type of sport you'd enjoy, as it's one-on-one, very technical, and countless of different styles can be successful. No, my problem with that is it doesn't have a good enough TV broadcast, and as a result, like, it's too niche for me, and I'm not immersed in that world enough. I also think it's an example of a sport that is a lot less fun to watch than to do. I think that's also bore out by the fact that people have never really been able to fully get on board in terms of MMA fans with the just grappling. They still think a lot of it's nonsense, even though it isn't. It's just that you have to kind of understand the technical elements to know why what the guy's doing is so impressive, or why like Damian Maia is one of the fucking GOAT players in terms of MMA Jiu-Jitsu. So I think it's actually kind of like European soccer in that sense. It's a weird, if you're American, you've ever watched soccer, you're like, this isn't fun. Just try playing it like five-a-side indoors. It's really fun. But it just doesn't translate as much on the screen, in my opinion. So I think that's the problem with it as a sport. It's just not really what I think as a spectator I'd like to do. I'd like to do it as an actual competitor. That'd probably sound quite fun and daily, but to follow, not as much. I like to learn about it. I like to follow like Marcelo Garcia's work online, so that's pretty interesting, but that's educational as opposed to entertainment. Anders Pettersson says, do you ever think any international esports event can compare to Dota 2's The International in prize money, hype, like LOL Worlds? Feel like both LOL and CSGO are bigger games, but are not even close in prize money. Right, they're not close in prize money because those people just refuse to properly implement crowdfunding. So that's the only reason Dota 2's is. If you take that away, Dota 2's would be very comparable to the League of Legends Worlds and only like 2 times or 3 times more than a CSGO major or something. So the big problem, if you haven't heard me go on this rant before, is they just don't let us have better formats in League of Legends Worlds or CSGO majors. If you give CSGO the kind of format I would create, it would destroy the international. It'd be way better in all regards, in my opinion. So the fact that Valve's the developer of both, but don't allow it in CSGO, is just unfortunately what happens when you let power-hungry game devs just go mad with the IP rights and ruin things in the same way as Riot just ruined EULCS for years by just refusing to let it properly compete with NALCS, when in my opinion it was always better and would have exceeded it in viewership. Istar. Have you ever read the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov, and if so, what did you think about it? I did read the first few books, and I thought it was good, but this was a long time ago. This was like in my teens, and it wasn't like the best shit ever where I felt like I had to keep reading. It was just interesting. I was trying to like lay a foundation, as it were, for my sci-fi reading at the time. I'll probably watch the TV show. Looks interesting, but I never actually found Asimov that interesting enough to go back and revisit. Some of his short stories aren't bad, but there's just too many authors in the world. The NA Kerfuffle. On the topic of playstyles for LOL, what factors do you think mould certain teams' playstyles? What factors warp a playstyle? And last of all, do you think certain players warp/mould a region's playstyle? Right, so overall, I think largely it's about personnel. In my opinion, the good players, the good coaches, and the good GMs basically look at the personnel they have, and from that, design the way they will make the team, they will balance the roles, they will set the playing style. You don't think, right, this is the best way to play League of Legends, I'm going to make you play this way. That's not the right approach, in my opinion, and won't yield the championships. So what you're looking for is, what is the comfort of the players and the collective group in terms of their style? What are the strengths of the individual players and the collective group? What are the weaknesses? And then you're going to design in favor of the strengths and towards comfort, and you're going to go away from weakness and away from discomfort, and that's going to tell you quite early on pretty much the basics of your style. Then you've got the mentality of the coach, how he wants to coach a game, what paradigm as to how he sees the game. You'll all know I'm not a fan of global meta thinking or copycat logic, where you copy what they do in another region without getting the mechanisms or the dynamics behind why that works. I think, for example, Youngbuck is a far better drafting coach than Reaper, despite the fact Reaper has had more success in more recent times, because I think Youngbuck does a way better job of drafting for his players. I think Reaper drafts for what he thinks his players should be, and sometimes they aren't, and that costs him. I think actually, if you want to talk about like players who warp a region's playing style, you have to be an amazing player in my opinion. So like Uzi, I think, along with Wei Zhao before him, did warp the Chinese region. I think it was all about AD carries. That was where they could have an edge over any region. I think mid lane with people like Froggen and Alexich and Expeke warped Europe to think mid lane has to be the role you play through and always give all the resources to. I think in Korea, to some degree, top lane did this when it was possible to carry. That's why you've had the greatest top laners come through that region, but not that many lane dominant AD carries, quite frankly, and the ones that are tend to have been people who've been over to LPL, unsurprisingly. Yeah, I think that's a lot of what does it. I also think another factor that changes or warps a playing style is when one gets very successful, but then one person comes up with the hard counter. And even if only they can do it, you see a lot of people start to copy that and think it's the approach for them overall. Like, I actually think what's bizarre is Team Liquid last year, in my opinion, was the hard counter to the overall prevailing style of League of Legends in NA, because other people didn't have good enough players and didn't have the experience and weren't as comfortable in those tough late game scenarios. So I actually think they, in theory, should have had the counter to what should have probably been the best style, which really probably should have been Cloud9's style. That should have been the dominant style. And then Team Liquid would have been their hard counter. That's why no one could do what Team Liquid did. But at the same time, they beat everyone, except when they went into international competition, they proved they didn't have overall the best style. Shikez is a CS hypothetical. If an exhibition CS 1.6 tournament were to be run today, are there any current teams you'd be particularly interested in watching play in it? What teams do you think would have the most success based on their style of play in CSGO? Right, if you watch the recent Know-It-Alls episode with me and Lopez, I think in different ways, not utility-based, that it was a very positional and tactical game in CS 1.6. So I want teams that have great supportive elements, great team balance. I do not think, for example, a team like FaZe Clan would have any chance in CS 1.6. So I would want teams like Astralis is an obvious example to throw in there. Mad Lions, I think, would do very well. I think even though that this will shock you, but I actually think in 1.6 that a team like Cloud9 could potentially be pretty good. I know they use a lot of utility in the modern day, but I just think positionally, some of their players have the smarts for it. I think they could get away with not having as much skill. I think they'd be a top 10 team maybe in 1.6. Who else can we pick out here? Like, I wouldn't take Liquid, I wouldn't take EG. I generally wouldn't be as big a fan of these teams, although I certainly think in terms of firepower, they could at least be fun dark horse teams. I don't think they'd be like dominant teams. I think maybe Big could be a team you could throw in there. They seem like they've put in the work in that sense. Who else? I might actually have liked to have seen last year's Ents when they still had Alexi B. I think that would be a pretty fun team. I think they could accomplish a lot. Yeah, I think those are good examples of teams. I, in general, hate exhibition stuff, so I get it that this is a hypothetical. I think you did a good idea there. Because in terms of modern-day exhibitions, I don't want to see them, quite frankly. James P., what are the characteristics that make up a great in-game leader? Some players start as IGL and grow over time, such as Alexi B, the tactical genius. However, other players are able to pick up the role and be competent but not great, aka Nico or Steoe. I'd point out those ones because it was more happenstance. They didn't really choose to take the role on as much as they just kind of were the last guy left and they just knew they could do it vaguely. I would say there's many strengths and styles to in-game leading, so definitely it's not a cookie-cutter thing. So let's start with preparation. In the modern day, yes, you have coaches, but this has always been a key part of what the in-game leader does. So overall preparation in all aspects of the game, pre-game preparation where you watch the demos before you play a match, post-game where you prepare from mistakes you made for what you're going to change for next game. I think leadership itself, it's within the name, but being a leader is a big deal. So as a man, being able to lead other men, to be able to command authority in terms of what you ask for. I think Carrigan sometimes failed in that sense because he tries to be more pally with the players and doesn't keep a distance to himself. I think having a personal touch helps, being able to go to this guy socially and make friends with him, or this guy and know what he's dealing with, or this guy and know what his comfort are and his weaknesses and not having be afraid to tell you privately one-on-one. I think that can be a big deal. I think in terms of calling strengths, they're very varied. You have the guys who are great in the mid-round, like the Stanislaws of the world and Carrigans. You have guys who can call from the spawn, execute a really great tactic. MSL was a classic for that. You have the people who can micromanage the existence, the God Bs of the world, who are really precisely going to tell you what to do. You have the guys who are great at a more loose style, who can just call and they can make the game work and they can frag a little bit. I think in terms of adaptation, there's a lot that an in-game leader can have. He can predict what's going to happen and adapt beforehand. He can adapt mid-round as it's happening, as certain great in-game leaders do. He can adapt, I think Glaive's very good at that. He can adapt post-round and do something for next round based on just the round before. A lot of in-game leaders need the whole half or a whole map or to go away and watch the demo to know what went wrong. Some of the brilliant guys like the Glaves of the world can do it in the game while they're playing. It reminds me of a great anecdote that I love Uwe, the legendary Terran Bonjour of StarCraft Brood War, but when he was a coach at SK Telecom said that he said when he watched Bisu, his main franchise player at the time, the great Protoss player, he said when he watched Bisu play, he was the only player he'd ever seen who was essentially doing a VOD review while still playing the game he was practicing, and that's the level he was operating on. That's what some of the genius IGLs can actually do. Starkiller Station says, hey Thorin, long-time fan. This is a pretty broad topic, and I think that it has its roots mostly in esports because it seems to run rampant on specific competitive titles. Basically, what are your thoughts on the idea that players should have any say in a roster or teammates that are to be recruited? I know that in CSGO, it seems to always come down to the players, but in League of Legends, it seems more like it's up to the orgs, or is that the wrong assumption? Should managers/recruiters have all the say in a professional esport like in regular sports, or can this ideology not fit in the current landscape of esports gaming? Example, Jason RR and Hiko refusing to play with recruited players in Valorant because they had no say seems quite entitled. Right, I don't think it generally should be the case. The reason I think it hasn't been in League of Legends is because they ramped up the amount of money and the amount of control that you had over those players. Like, for example, if people don't know, in League of Legends, you can't get promoted into LCS or LEC as a team. So if people don't like you, so story that Veteran often told about Jizuki. Apparently he was a monster on solo queue, but because he was too toxic to people or an arsehole, people just didn't want to recruit him. But he forced his way in by just beating people in the promotion tournament. If you can't do that anymore, then just like the NFL, you can be a monster player like Antonio Brown and just never get back in because people don't like you and you're tainted goods. So I think in that kind of a setting, yeah, you can have very talented players who can't get in. So I think actually just naturally Riot gave a lot of that power to the orgs over the players, whereas in like Valve actually give a lot of power to the players, right? If they leave and 3 out of 5 of them have this major slot, they can take the major slot away from the player and from the org, and they can have some say there. I'd also say this goes hand in hand with giving the power to the coaches and the GMs, and therefore if they're bad, firing them and getting the good ones. They're the people I think appropriately should do the role. Because in my opinion, I think generally players shouldn't have much say. It's different if there's significant personal beef. Maybe that guy really said some fucked up shit about me or did something to me or screwed me. In that case, yeah, I don't want him being recruited to the same team as me, and a player should have some input. Similarly, I think that there's just too much money, though, to go the other way and have players recruiting their friends or people they just like, etc. You've got to let people who are the money handlers have some say in where the money goes, in my opinion. One area I will say I think players should have input is if I have a superstar player, just because I want to keep him on side and I want him to sign his next contract and stay with me, I'm going to at least take his input on players he'd like to play with or not play with. But generally, I think the coaches and the GM should do it and the players should shut the fuck up and play and just see if it works in the game, because it's irrelevant whether you're friends or not if it works in the server, in my opinion. Another question by the big one. He says, would you ever consider playing in one of the show matches that showcase pros, casters, analysts, etc. at events such as IEM Sydney? Since you are pretty good at the game and enjoy bantering, it seems like a good fit, right? First of all, I've never actually gone to IEM Sydney, so it couldn't be the Cashes or that one there. Secondly, I don't work with ESL at the moment and probably won't in the near future unless they basically apologise for some shit, which is probably never going to happen. So I don't know that there's going to be chances to play in a show match. I'm not a big fan of them, so I wasn't planning on running one at Flashpoint. If I'd have been there, because a lot of people don't know this, they never ever asked me to play in one. The only one I was ever asked to play in was the Starladder Berlin Major one, which got cancelled. Otherwise, we would have played it, and that was going to be in 1.6, so I was actually looking forward to that. I'll also say, and by the way, I think the reason they don't ask me, not really sure actually, probably just don't want to give me more stage time. Who the fuck knows? You can speculate that yourself, I don't really know. I also have never bragged about playing the game. I would say, by the way, since he said, since you are pretty good at the game, I'm not pretty good at the game. I mean, I'm nowhere near the pro level. I'm better than some of the talent. Like, I think I'd fuck some of those guys up. And maybe some lower level pros I could catch by surprise, but I'm definitely not good at the game in any context. In terms of the bantering part, that's why I think I would be a great fit. I would be an amazing showman. Listen, I get any kills, I'm going to be barking so loud, I'm going to talk mad shit, I'm going to get banter in there. I think I could make it a lot of fun, so I would play one. I don't give a fuck if people think I'd do badly, and if I would do badly. By the way, I wouldn't play safe and go for KDA like a lot of analysts and talents have disappointed me by doing. I'd just go all out and go and make plays and try and make a show of it, whether I get rocked or not. So I certainly think if I got the chance, I would probably do it, but I've actually enjoyed just having Sunday mornings off or whatever the fuck that shit is. Right, Calvin Satayacom says, What are your thoughts on hip-hop culture as a form of spirituality or religion? Have you read The Gospel of Hip-Hop or The Tao of Wu? Right, the one area I'm concerned with that is listen, I love wacky conspiracy theories that are really out there and sort of stretch the boundaries of your brain while you're trying to put them in your mind. So, listen, as like sci-fi, all that like 5% of shit it's certainly interesting if you've never heard it. Like if you go and read it, you'll be like, what the fuck is this? But the problem is, some of these guys you're talking about are influenced by that. So I get the sense already that their mythology ain't for me. I think it's a little bit too whack, like sort of sci-fi B-movie from the 60s. So no, I haven't read any of that shit. It's not particularly interesting to me. There's a lot more interesting, like there's a never-ending rabbit hole of spirituality and like Gnosticism and occult stuff and religion and mythology by some of the greatest artists and writers of all time and occult thinkers. So like, I don't really need to know what like RZA thinks about that. I'd prefer to just hear another Bobby Digital album from him, not really a whole lot about spirituality. So I've never looked into it. It sounds a bit whack to me. If it isn't, by the way, maybe you can tell me why it isn't and something interesting about it, because I have no real into that, quite frankly. And also, I've got to say, I've always thought like RZA, etc., were pretty pretentious. Like they're the people who sort of go out their way to name check stuff and act like they're super intellectual. But like, I don't know that people who are super intellectual say, no, I'm saying like 7,000 times the fucking paragraph, you know? I think if you read enough, you probably like get inculcated towards a wider vocabulary and ability to express yourself. So I've always thought that guy was a bit of a poser outside of music where he can be very good. Pedro Rojas. 2 questions, you can pick one. I'll just go ahead and pick one and skip the other one on this one. So I'm going to pick his question because I like it. I like roster building questions. He says, if every Finnish player was a free agent, could they make an S-tier team? And what would this team be, right? First of all, they did. I mean, I already think Ents could have been, quite with all the problems this year, again, one of the best teams. But they sadly broke it up and big old Alu had to get his ego in the way. So first and foremost, even though I can technically pick anyone, I'm not going to take Alu. I even think actually like I can find Orpaz who are comparable. So I'm going to start with Alexi B. I think he's the first person you have to have in this team. He's the best IGL. I've heard him on comms enough to know this guy's mustard. I really like him as an IGL, and there's no one else comparable in Finland right now. Saw's way too bad a fragger. So I'm going to take Alexi B as my IGL. I'm going to add Sonny, because I always want to see those two play together. I think he can be more of a forward-facing attacking player, brilliant rifler. I think actually Alexi B would use him very well and make him one of the best players in the world. Then I've got Sergey, but he doesn't even have to be a star player. But I also think Alexi B was influential over him and used him well. If he can make Sonny and Sergey really good players, we've got mad firepower in this team, and the others don't even have to provide any. In terms of AWPing, I'm going to take hybrid AWP as Sloy from Havu. I loved how he played at Flashpoint. I like the fact he was a playmaker. He didn't play too passive like some of his teammates. Like Zori, I think, would get eaten up at the tier 1 level. This guy had the chops to go head-to-head with the Fallens of the world, and I think could be a very good hybrid AWP in this team, but he can also rifle, and he likes to play attacking Counter-Strike. Then I'll add in as my last player, I'll take X7. This guy knows how to play the supportive elements. He's good in clutches. He's fairly good on LAN. Like, he seems to have a pretty stable mental. He worked with Alexi B in the past. He's played with Sergey before. I think this rounds out a pretty fucking solid team. I think this team could be one of the absolutely an S-tier team in the world, and they could contend with the best teams out there. I love the balance there. I think they've got more firepower than Ents, actually. So I'd love to make that team. Justin Reed, have you ever tried playing/following Smite? Spoiler, no. In my opinion, it is a much better casual experience for getting into than the morbid genre, while still having enough depth to be interesting to follow as an esport, and I'm surprised it never exploded in popularity. I've been following it since it was released on consoles, and it was the game that made me realise video games could be treated similarly to sports in terms of necessary teamwork needed to win, and being able to individually get much better through practice. Yeah, no, I've never watched it, I've never played it. The problem is I'm not really into MOBA. Like, similar with RTS, I'm not into that. It's just that the scene around League of Legends was interesting. The potential success for content in esports, a whole new field of players I'd never interviewed, a different type of a game to sink my teeth into as like a 5th or 6th category. I'm not really into MOBAs in general. I just like Dota 2 because it's a straight fighter game and their circuit's really good. So I'm not really into MOBAs in general, mate. Nothing against Smite particularly. The first person aspect certainly sounds interesting. Carl's Song says, hypothetically, when in Faker's career, do you think he should have played in a different team, and what teammates would you have liked to see him with? Thank you for your work. Right, basically after 2017, so post Season 7 Worlds, I think he should have looked at his team and said, I've got to get the fuck out of this team. They don't know what they're doing around me. And I think his team should have looked at that lineup and said, this doesn't work. We're going to get different players in. Because in my opinion, that 2018 was such a fucking waste because they didn't realise, like, yes, later on he would go on to win championships and get the good teammates, but that year was really grim. Like, they wasted a whole year of Faker still being a decent player. I think he fell off actually from confidence from having such a shit team around him because they didn't learn from what he did at Worlds. They stupidly thought, we should even have won Worlds Finals. We did good making it to Worlds Finals. We still won LCK and we still won MSI. Like, they didn't realise how garbage that last 6 months should have been, where they didn't come close. Well, they wouldn't have won LCK and they didn't. They should have probably, in my opinion, have gone out at least in the semis of Worlds, if not the quarters. Like, I thought the whole thing was nonsense. So I actually think if they recruited better players then, they could have had an epic team. Like, they obviously could have had a bunch of the players that were in some of the other teams. So first and foremost, I've always wanted to see Faker paired up with Deft, because I think Deft already had the carry game of a monster ADC that someone like Teddy just doesn't seem to want to play, doesn't want to have all the resources chunked through him all the time, but also, because of his time on Samsung Blue, was the late game presence. So I think him and Faker combined, who at their times in their career have been able to do both, if they were really in peak form, they would be unstoppable. I think that's the best duo for me. I think Deft's a contender for greatest player of all time as well, so I'd love to see them play together. He already played with Mata, so I don't know about that one. I've always wanted to see him with a better jungler. Like, I would love to have seen Score and Faker together. These guys are so self-sufficient. They both have an amazing understanding of the map, shot calling. They could do a lot. I'd also like to see Smeb play with him. If you notice, I'd basically like Faker to be in that KT super team, if I'm being honest. But I think Smeb also, another guy who can shot call, who can play without a great jungler, who knows when to be aggressive, when to be self-sufficient. Like this, these players, it just makes sense to put them together. I'll give you a classic one I always wanted, and it's actually where Duke actually beat out this player for this. Flame went and tried the SKT trial a couple of times and was even doing well. And the rumour was actually that he was going to get picked up at one point in time. I'd love to have seen Flame and Faker play together. Those for me are just two of the great solo laners in Korean history. And to playing together, imagine what they could accomplish. I think a lot, no matter who their bot lane had been. And if you had a stable bot lane like Bang & Wolf, that'd be fucking dynamite, that lineup. I think they could probably win Worlds and everything. Peyton Lee Trahan says, hey Thorin, what do you think Moses' biggest strengths for coaching is going to be? Personality. He's one of the most amiable people you'll ever meet. He can get along with anyone. He can connect with anyone, become friends with anyone. That is a big deal if you're going to be a coach. Experience. He was a pro player, and he was a pro player long before these players were, and back when certain elements sometimes had more pressure. So I think he could probably relate to the players. He's been in the scenario where you have like 5 people in one hotel room. He could basically do a lot for these young guys. Especially commitment. I mean, he's all in on this. He's not doing it as a tourist. He's got to win now and not just be decent. He's not there just to be like, but in MIBR I was doing all right. Like, we finished top 8 and top 4 once. No, he knows he has to win with this lineup. So I think his commitment is going to be way higher than some of the other coaches who are doing it as a general career and think, well, I'll move on to another team if it doesn't work. Or, oh, well, I tried, it didn't work. Moses knows he has to make it. Otherwise, why not just go back to being talented and do something else? Right, last question. Hotwire with a 1. Says, you recently mentioned you are looking for a new website to write for. I just left a Sertor in a manner that wasn't amicable. Fuck them, basically. Whatever happened to the idea that you pitched a few years ago of starting your own website? Is this not the right opportunity for it? Right? In terms of me starting my own website, I think you're referring to what I said I'd do with Patreon. I'm going to launch it fairly soon, actually, which is I have a website. It's already coded. It has been for months and months. Just there's been some issues on my end that I have to finish out a few things that are preventing me from launching it properly. But that's to showcase my historical content and be a place to archive it all. It's not really, actually, to be a place to publish my content and then put it on Reddit, for example. And the reason why is, if you don't know, it's very hard to make money from monetizing online content. The rates I get paid by these sites, they basically lose money to pay me to write for them, to give themselves status or to get a certain number of views and then get the money back through the sponsorship. They don't make it from ad revenue. So as a result, I think people vastly overestimate how much money you can make yourself from that. So I have no interest in making my own site right now in that regard. Like, that would just be a money sink for me that would lose me money, not make me money. Now in the future, I might do it because I've got some very unique ways that no one's tried in esports that I'm taking from different fields of online commerce and marketing that I might try, that I might allow me to do my own service. I'm even thinking about a pay-per-view service with a paywall. But I'm going to think about that and look towards it. And by the way, don't worry if you're a Patreon. All my patrons beyond a certain tier, I'm going to find a way to integrate it. So if I ever do a pay-per-view angle, some of you beyond a certain tier, you'll just get access to it. Like, you'll just be part of your patronage and your tier. So don't ever worry about that. So, yeah, in the future, maybe, but it's not really something for me for right now, mate. That's not where I'm at in my career or where esports is at, quite frankly. Right, that's the end. If you want to ask a question for the next one, the thread's in the description box. Anyone who is on the $10 or more Patreon tier can ask a question. And if it's interesting or it's appropriate, I'll answer it in one of the next ones. This video was kindly supported by Pronogo, Whattathings, Spencer Green, Soliko, Dean Tanglis, Jack Hanna, Hades, Jensen Goh, the Puyallup Tribe, JDubs, Tobias Bernasconi, Alexander Rao, and a special thanks, as always, goes out to Jerky's Minion. Would you like to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Maybe you'd like to put a question to me in my monthly video AMA. Do you want teasers for my upcoming content? Or maybe to even take part in an online esports discussion with moi? Well, if so, put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today in the Patreon link in the description box below.